Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is the second part of a conversation with Dr. Lawrence Korb on U.S. foreign and military policy and practices, and part of City Talk's series of conversations on the central issues of the 2008 campaign. The U.S. military today is stressed and strained. The defense budget is heavily influenced by politics that distorts strategic and operational priorities. Hundreds of thousands of regular Army and National Guard troops are the victims of what can only be described as malign neglect, shortchanged by their government. To talk about U.S. military priorities, strategies, and force structures, and the Defense Department budget is Dr. Lawrence J. Korb. Dr. Korb served as Assistant Secretary of Defense during the Reagan administration, where he administered about 70% of the Defense Department budget. He has been widely credited for turning a hollow, broken military into the modern, effective force it was in the first Gulf War. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a senior advisor to the Center for Defense Information. Previously, he directed national security studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and before that, as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, he had led the Center for Public Policy Education, and before that was the Dean of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Korb has written 20 books and more than 100 articles on national security issues. He has made over 1,000 appearances on such shows as The Today Show, Face the Nation, This Week with David Brinkley, The NewsHour, Nightline, 60 Minutes, The O'Reilly Factor, and Crossfire. His more than 100 op-ed pieces have appeared in major newspapers throughout the country and the world. Welcome back, Larry.
Nice to be back, Doug.
Okay. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Georgia. We talked about Iraq. We talked about Afghanistan. What I'd like to do is move from the international scene and talk about military policy, what it is and what it should be. When you were Assistant Secretary, you were charged with saving the all-volunteer force under President Reagan. What is the situation then? What is the situation now? Are there parallels?
Well, there are parallels in the sense that when President Reagan came into office, the military was in bad shape. They were taking in people who shouldn't have been in because they were having a tough time recruiting in the post-Vietnam.
Sounds like the current day. We'll talk about that.
That's right, because you asked me, what are the parallels?
Right. Okay.
What are the parallels to now? You had people leaving the military because you were overstressing them because the force was not of the right size. The equipment wasn't what it should have been. And what happened was, and it was really to President Reagan's credit, he reignited a spirit of patriotism in the country. People really wanted to serve. We improved the pay and benefits for military people. And because of that, we were able, within a decade, really to get a military that in terms of its educational and aptitude requirements and experience was better than at any time we ever had in history.
And the current day?
Well, what has happened is the Army particularly is broken. And the reason for that is the volunteer Army was never set up to fight a long war. The idea was you should have a comparatively small active duty Army, maybe to handle like the first Persian Gulf War or to handle the situation in the Balkans. And then if you had a long war, the Guard and Reserve would be a bridge to resuming the draft, which
Okay.
is why we make young men register when they turn 18.
Right.
But what happened is this administration did not want to talk about the draft because they were afraid if they did, American people might not support the war.
Remembering 68 and Vietnam.
In Iraq. And so what they've done is they've overused the active force. We have a social compact with people that serve, that volunteer, that for every year you spend in a combat zone, you should spend 2 years at home. One to sort of decompress, the other is to train to go back.
Right.
Army people are lucky if they spend 15 months there. They're lucky if they get a year at home. And we have people that have gone to Iraq and Afghanistan 3, 4, 5 times. As a result, you have several 100,000 cases of what they call post-traumatic stress syndrome. The Guard and Reserve are not a strategic reserve, they're an operational reserve. We have a compact with them that we shouldn't call them up more than 1 year out of every 5 years. Several units here in New York have been called up 2, 3, 4 times since 2001. And then the third problem you have, since you don't have enough troops, since you don't want to go to draft, you using private contractors to do military functions. Now, since America has turned against the war in Iraq, they're discouraging their sons and daughters who might normally want to join the Army from doing so. And so the Army has had to lower its educational standards, its aptitude standards, and give waivers. Last year, the Army gave moral waivers to about 11%
Talk
of the
about
recruits.
moral waivers. 11%, 1 out of every 9.
Basically, what that means is for criminal convictions. Last year, the Army took in over 800 people with felony convictions. I mean, as I told someone, the NFL wouldn't draft you with that record.
Right.
But they're having to do that because the country has turned against the war. Nobody wants to go to the draft, so they're having to take what they can get.
Also, you've got high-level officials, generals, retiring, as well as more lower-level command-type personnel.
The real problem is that your West Point graduates particularly are getting out when they're 5 years of service.
Why?
But because their families are saying, how many times are you going to keep going back to Iraq and Afghanistan? You don't have any time in between that you should. And what happens is, because of that, the good ones leave because they're the ones who feel they can make it on the outside.
Right.
And so basically in 10, 15 years from now, we'll turn around and say, where are the General Petraeuses or where are the General Ordinary? Well, they're gone. They got out when their obligated service was up because of the stress that we're putting on them.
Now, in addition to the stress, or as a result of the stress, I mean, you have high rates of suicide, you have all kinds of psychological difficulties, divorce. I mean, you list in your study, The Quality of Military Life, financial problems, a whole homelessness, a whole host of problems that are there that we're going to have to pay for that's not in the defense budget or not in the supplemental appropriations.
Well, I mean, the cost,
forget about the human cost.
The cost of this war from financial purposes, when you look at things like paying veterans benefits, interest on the national debt, the cost of the war in this is going to end up probably $3 trillion. Yeah,
Joseph Stiglitz in his book talked about this as the $3 trillion war.
That's right. And right now the direct costs are about $700 billion. I mean, that's just for fighting it. Doesn't include the benefits that you have to pay. And the real tragedy is they didn't prepare for this. So the VA budget, this administration tried to cut it. They haven't.
Walter Reed was a mess.
They haven't. In fact, they're closing Walter Reed. I mean, Rumsfeld, in the middle of a war, decides to close Walter Reed, actually, and shift it to another place. Again, the administration has never put anybody other than the troops fighting the war on a wartime footing.
Let's talk about supporting the troops. We hear this constantly from the president. We hear it from the vice president. We hear it from the Defense Department, and we hear it from Senator McCain. You look at what they've done with the troops. I mean, you've begun to articulate, but they didn't have enough armor. You had to buy your own. The equipment wasn't appropriate. And Rumsfeld goes to war and says, "You go to the war that you've got."
If you go to war with the Army, I think that you have. Again, they did not want to do all those things like buy armor the Humvees, buy the new vehicles, the mine resistant vehicles, the MARPs, because they didn't want to admit that this war would go on a long time. See, because
they didn't want to admit it, or they didn't even think of it. I mean, which is worse.
Well, I mean, they assumed that we'd be greeted as liberators in Iraq, and we'd be out basically.
And the mission was being accomplished
by the end of 2003. So if you said, well, gee, let's buy some more body armor, then people would assume that you were going to stay there longer and your casualties. You know, Francis Fukuyama, who wrote the book The End of History, put it very well. He said, if you had told the American people back in 2003 that you're going to go to war in Iraq, spend $1 trillion, lose more than 4,000 brave young men and women, wound 30,000, and kill a couple 100,000 Iraqis so Iraq could have an election, you'd have been laughed out of the ballpark.
Right.
Those are Frank's words. And I think that sums up what's happened.
Let's talk about what the military, I mean, it's shocking. I'm almost speechless, and that doesn't happen very often. Let's talk about the quarterly defense review. Now, this may sound
quadrennial defense review.
Quadrennial, I'm sorry,
yeah,
defense review. Since 1996, the Congress has required the Defense Department to conduct a major defense review, and they did it in February of '06. And you were highly critical of this quadrennial report, and in a sense, offered your own. So let's talk about where the Pentagon thinks it is and ought to be, and where you think it is and ought to be.
Well, if you look at the, as they call it, the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review that came out in February 2006, they did not expand the size of the ground forces, the Army and the Marines. And finally, they had a year later they did, but it didn't have that in there. And the Rumsfeld's idea was you could substitute technology for manpower. That does not work in an insurgency or nation.
And this is a conflict between Powell and Rumsfeld going back, that Rumsfeld won, Powell lost, the boots on the ground.
Powell, General Powell was at a disadvantage because he was the Secretary of State then, not the Secretary of Defense.
Right.
But I mean, the Powell-Weinberger doctrine basically said, when you go to war, make sure you have enough force to cover whatever might happen. The other problem was that if you take a look at the Quadrennial Defense Review, there were no hard decisions made. We're still buying weapons that deal with threats from a bygone era. Explain. Well, I mean, basically, you're buying weapons that were designed to fight the Cold War against a major conventional power. The F-A-22 fighter, the Osprey. I mean, there were a number of weapon systems. There's several weapon systems that the Pentagon didn't want, but was forced on them. Well, it's a combination of the service wanting it. Okay, for example, the Air Force wants the F-22. Right. The people in the districts who it's built, and there's something like 88 factories around the country working on this. They support it, so it's hard to kill it. Use the Boeing case as an example. Well, I think if you take a look at the two examples from Boeing, one was when Boeing got the Air Force to build the tankers. This is back in 2002, without doing a study, seeing what they needed, without competing it, and then trying to tell us that leasing was cheaper than buying, okay? And that got through. I mean, I'll give Senator McCain credit. He's the one who blew the whistle on that, because Secretary of the Air Force, the Armed Services Committee had approved it, and it really basically was a bad deal. So then they recompeted it, and they had a competition between Boeing and foreign Airbus, from Europe, and partnering with Northrop Grumman. But it was so badly managed, they have to do it over again. And see, the problem with this administration, the thing we used to always say, that the Republicans are the party of competence, the Democrats compassionate. This has been the most incompetent administration I've ever seen, whether it's Hurricane Katrina, managing a war, doing the defense budget. The cost overruns on your defense programs are basically worse than we've ever had. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. Because when they picked people for the jobs in the Pentagon, they didn't pick the right people. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, the number 2 person, this is the person who manages this trillion-dollar enterprise. This job had been held, for example, by David Packard at one time. It had been held by Don Atwood, who was number 2 at General Motors. What they did is they picked Paul Wolfowitz, and Paul is great academic like us, but he's not a good manager. He had no big experience, and so he didn't do his job. And so the situation got out of control. And even Rumsfeld, when they asked him about the Boeing scandal, people went to jail. And they said, well, what do you think about it? He said, well, I was vaguely aware of it. It was a $24 billion deal. And this is what I mean. They just weren't paying attention to what was happening.
Another criticism that you had of the QDR was the real lack of reduction in the nuclear weapons stockpile, some 7,000 of them. Mm-hmm. Why reduce it? Is there a need? Why didn't we do it?
Okay, there are three good reasons. Number one, the biggest danger to the United States is what we call nuclear proliferation, a nuclear weapon falling in the hands of an extreme regime like in Iran or North Korea, or in the hands of a group like Al-Qaeda. So if you want to stop proliferation, you need to lead by example. And the head of the Strategic Command said, and I quote him in there, we only need 600 operational, 400 in reserve, 1,000. So why are we got these? So if we were to do that, it would send a signal to the world, hey, nuclear weapons are not the way to, the way to go, so let's move in that direction. Number two, it would save you a lot of money. You're spending $20 billion a year on weapons that you don't need, and we've got other needs in the defense budget. And finally, the interesting ththing is military people don't like nuclear weapons because they know you're probably never going to use them. And
well, that's the whole idea.
That's right. Yeah.
You scared the hell out of the other guy so he doesn't do anything. And another critique that you had, and which is part of a larger policy initiative on your part, is that they only had small increases in homeland defense, that this administration really has not spent the money domestically in a way that would maximize security. And you suggest changing the mission of both the active military, but more particularly the National Guard and what you call the Home Guard, to more homeland security activities.
Well, if you take a look at national security, you have an offensive component, which is funded in the Department of Defense budget.
Right.
You have a defensive component that's funded in the Department of Homeland Security. And then you've got a preventive, which is funded primarily for the Agency for International Development in the State Department. Now, what I try to point out, if you look at those in total, you find out we're too heavy on the offense, not enough on the defense. Or as the football people would say, defense.
Right.
Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. The Pentagon is building a national missile defense system, which we spend about $13 billion a year.
This is Star Wars?
Basically,
okay.
It's Star Wars, come back. And it doesn't work. And they're deploying it, even though it doesn't work.
And there's an argument that it can almost theoretically never work.
Right. Your physicists will tell you it really can't deal with decoys. But if you look at it this way and you say, if somebody wants to shoot a nuclear or get a nuclear weapon into the United States, are they going to shoot it with a return address, knowing we've got 6,000 we could retaliate against? Or are they going to try and sneak it in a container? Probably in a container. But we spend more on one program, missile defense, than the entire Coast Guard. The higher, not just the...
And we're only, 7 blocks away from the river.
Yeah, and so that's what I mean. You need to, you got your priorities wrong. And similarly, if you don't want to have a draft and you use the National Guard as an operational reserve, in other words, to rotate with the active forces, who's going to protect us at home? Okay, when Hurricane Katrina hit, the Guard units from Mississippi and Louisiana were in Baghdad with their equipment. So there was nobody there, and they had to bring in stuff from other states. People died needlessly. Right,
and you had wildfires in California. We had recently flooding in the Mississippi. You've got national emergencies that are part of our security that aren't being adequately dealt. How does Korb deal with this?
Well, basically, what you ought to do is you ought to set up a home guard in each state where people could volunteer, doctors, lawyers, medical people, people that work in the police and fire department or whatever it might be, and they would be called up when your regular guard was away. Now, we got some segments of that in many states, but the federal government ought to fund it, make sure the people are trained, and people would want to do that. Americans are looking to sacrifice in this struggle against these violent extremists.
And not to shop.
And we've never been asked to do. I mean, I think history will look back in 2001, where basically we didn't call on the American people to sacrifice. You know what military people will tell you when you talk to them? We went to war, you went to Walmart. And then that's not really what should be done. We should have been sacrificing.
You've argued that, and I quote it, that we need a fundamental shift in military doctrine and priorities. What are these priorities? What's the Korb doctrine?
Well, basically, you got to figure out who your enemies are. And the first thing is we have three short-term and one long-term. Short-term, you got these violent extremists like Al-Qaeda. Number two, you have extreme regimes like Iran and North Korea. And number three, you have weak and failing states that if they collapse, with globalization, they could spread disease or they could become havens for terrorists.
Sure, and have nuclear weapons at the same time.
That's correct. Okay, and then you have a long term, which is the rising powers. And so who
may not necessarily pose a military threat, but certainly a strategic threat.
That's right. And so what's happened is the budget is too focused on the last, if you will, the rising powers. You know, getting ready to refight the Cold War or even World War II. I mean, then we argued in there that the Navy was building this open ocean destroyer, this DDG 1000, okay, the Zumwalt class destroyer. They wanted to build 32 of them. This week they finally canceled the thing after 2. They shouldn't have even started, but you spend close to $10 billion and they find out it doesn't deal with the threats that you do.
Could they have known that answer before they spent?
Well, they could, but see, the problem is not.
Or was it didn't they even think of it?
The problem is not the services. If you spend your life in the Navy, you believe in sea power. If you spend your life in the air, the problem, that's why you have civilian control. The job when I was in government and the people there now, you got to say, that's a great idea, Admiral or General, but let me tell you, you know, we really need to worry about them smuggling it in, you see, in a container ship. Or we really need to get more boots on the ground because technology's fine, but it doesn't substitute.
So they have their own institutional and bureaucratic, if you will, prerogatives and interests.
Sure, and that's not surprising. You need to understand that.
And that still exists.
Oh, sure. And what happens if you don't have strong civilian control, basically, it gets out of hand. Your job I used to tell people when we worked through there, if you leave here and the services love you, you probably haven't done your job because your job is to say no when they come up with ideas that may help them but don't contribute to the national interest.
Okay, let's move to personalities for a second. Segueing from your comment, Donald Rumsfeld was not well liked by military commanders, but they had to listen. I mean, and assess Rumsfeld and his tenure as Secretary of Defense and what the Rumsfeld years mean.
Well, basically, what Rumsfeld did is he treated the Pentagon like a hostile takeover. He was coming in to take over, say, an automobile company today that is making SUVs instead of small Priuses or something like that. But it wasn't in bad shape, and he decided he had to get rid of everything and turn the place upside down. He also did not recognize, even after September 11th, that technology couldn't substitute for manpower. And basically, he had some good ideas, but he never listened. And he thought, he had all of the good ideas. Just to give you an example, when General Shinseki, the Army Chief of Staff, a man who lost his foot in Vietnam, who directed peacekeeping operations in the Balkans, when Carl Levin, Senator Levin from Michigan, said, well, how many troops will you need after Saddam falls? He said several 100,000. Rumsfeld criticized them, rather than sort of like if your doctor says, well, you better, lose a few pounds or you better get more. You say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, and that to me, in other words, there was the man with the expertise.
Oh, but this seems to be Rumsfeld nor Bush listened to their generals. I mean, most recently, we've had the resignation of some of your top American military commanders, and you got to believe a lot of it was in opposition to presidential policy.
Well, again, what happens is the military's been used. When the president, things aren't going well, he said, well, I'm listening to my generals, you say, and then you try and blame them, for the, and really it does, I mean, I think you have got to, I mean, the key to being chief executive like the president is or Secretary of Defense is to know when to listen and when to, not to listen. And some secretaries have been very good at it, some have not. But Rumsfeld was probably the worst because at a time of national emergency, he refused to change the preconceptions he had come into office with, that technology could substitute for manpower. We wouldn't get involved in reconstruction.
Facts didn't disturb the theory.
That's correct.
Isn't this symptomatic of the entire Bush administration's approach to international relations?
Well, they came in with an ideology, and they looked for facts to support it, rather than being open to as new data changed. I mean, they were determined, as Paul O'Neill, who was the Secretary of the Treasury in the first year, told us, they were determined to go to Iraq even before September 11th. Right. And so they were looking for bits and pieces of information that would justify that, rather than putting those information.
They needed an event to justify the policy.
That's correct. The British said they fixed the facts to support their policy.
The case. Okay. Last couple of minutes. Obama wins the presidency. He names you Secretary of Defense. What are your recommendations? What are your priorities?
I think the first thing that you've got to do is this quadrennial defense review that you've talked about, to get the military to adjust to the real threats of today. The other thing is you've got to get your forces out of Iraq so you can put more into Afghanistan, and also give the military the respite that it needs from being overstressed. You expand the size of the ground forces, but you don't lower your standards. It's better to take a smaller number of people than take people who are not.
Take women and gays.
Well, I think, women are already in there, but I would drop all of the restrictions and just say, if you can do it. I mean, women, for all practical purposes, they do it in Iraq. Okay. And the same way with gays. I mean, here we are throwing out qualified people. We're having a tough time getting people. And the attitudes in the military have changed so much, and in the country, it's not going to be the problem.
What else do you recommend?
Well, I think the other thing that you need to recommend is I would get this home guard going. I think you need to do that. I think that you need to get rid of a lot of these Cold War era weapons. You've got to cut your nuclear forces. Those are all the things I think that you need to do. And then finally, have a unified national security budget, because the Coast Guard is in Homeland Defense, so it doesn't compete against missile defense. The president should be able to look at them all together.
Thank you. This has been the second part of a conversation with Dr. Lawrence Korb on U.S. foreign and military policy and practices, and part of City Talk's series of conversations on the central issues of the 2008 campaign. Please come back.
Okay, Doug, it was good to see you again.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.